Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done by folks who have used the historical collections in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins us today. Hunter Moskowitz is a PhD candidate in world history at Northeastern University. Hunter, thanks for speaking with me today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching and writing about?
So my research looks at textile factories and textile workers in early 19th century, the US and Mexico. So I look at sort of the racial management of textile factories. And I look how the movement of machines, workers, and ideas about industrial production across the world was sort of shaped in the early 19th century, and how that informed ideas of race and how factories were sort of structured around racial hierarchies. So that's sort of the broad strokes. And then I kind of look at specific sites individually to sort of get like case studies of like, okay, how did this process actually work? So I look at Lowell, Massachusetts, of course, like the kind of basis of the first sort of textile factories. And there's been tons of research of really interesting different perspectives on how Lowell has been talked about. But I'm sort of interested in looking at like, okay, first of all, thinking about its connections to other factories and other places around the world. And also thinking about race a little bit more critically when thinking about how workers worked, how sort of the factory towns were set up geographically, and also thinking about some of like the labor protests from that perspective as well. So I'm looking at Lowell. I'm also looking at Monterrey, Mexico, which is a city that in later, sort of in the 19th century, really goes through like rapid industrialization. But at the time period I'm looking at, like the 1830s to the 1860s, it's still sort of the very beginnings of that are started. What I'm really how I kind of came upon looking at that city is because a lot of the equipment there was sent from Massachusetts to set up those factories. And many of the sort of upper management may have also come from the US. I'm also looking at Concord, North Carolina. That was another place that got machinery from Massachusetts and from Philadelphia. And it is kind of different because it's one of the first like steam factories in those regions. So technologically, it has some sort of differences of how it was structured. But it's also interesting because it's kind of a rural area. And so it kind of contrasts these in big industrial cities. And then at Hagley, too, I'm interested in sort of the mid-Atlantic region. So there were so many great when I visited, there's so many great records of textile factories in Maryland and Delaware. Especially, I looked a lot at the Antietam mills. The Bancroft family records have a lot about mills in Rockford, Delaware. So I'm also thinking about the Mid-Atlantic region as sort of another place that got technology from a lot of different areas. And I should say the one thing that sort of ties a lot of this together is machine shops. So that was another big area of interest that I'm looking at, like how were these machine shops not just producing like physical technology themselves, but what kind of ideas were they sending along with this technology? Because often, the factories were not set up necessarily just by the management. They were actually used machine shop workers to come to the factory and originally set it up and sort of teach the practices of industrial production. So I'm interested in looking at sort of the spread that way too.
Well, it's such a fascinating topic. I have to tell you, it's right after my own heart as someone with a background in industrial history as well. What attracted you to this subject in the first place?
I got interested in this subject from looking at Lowell. Because I grew up in that area and I have some like family connections to there as well, to some of the last kind of textile factories. And so when I was looking at some of the early records of the workers in Lowell, and like there's such that this rich history of like all this worker literature where you can actually like really read like, and it's not just about like industrial stuff, it's really about like anything they were thinking about. There's all these like romantic descriptions of nature you can read, a lot of these like religious texts. And so it was interesting to read this, but I realized when you read them, they actually talk a lot about stuff that's like in Mexico. There's all these stories written about Mexico. There's always things talked about Europe and around the world. And so I got interested in thinking about like, okay, taking sort of more of like a global perspective. And these on workers and their understandings of the world.
Hmm.
And so that's, I think, kind of drove thinking about some of these connections. And then realizing too, from doing some initial research that I've looked a lot at the Witten Machine Works in Northbridge, Massachusetts, which was one of like the big producers of different kinds of, especially mechanical pickers, which were like getting the impurities out of cotton once they arrived at the factory. And I realized that they were sending these like all over the place. Like really the distribution was extremely wide. And so it got me thinking about like, okay, there's on one hand, we have this connection of workers in Lowell who are thinking more globally. And on the other hand, the technology is moving globally too. So sort of both the sides of that, I think got me really interested in thinking about that. And I was reading sort of about sort of the movement too of the technology and especially how workers were thinking about it, right? Race was like a big concept that was coming up in a lot of the descriptions of how workers talked about their work, how they talked about other workers in general. And so that has also sort of filtered in as sort of like a theme for thinking about uniting these concepts.
Hmm. I think one of the real strengths of your approach here is that transnational comparative approach, and it seems like it was baked right into your sources as soon as you started. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. And I was definitely interested in looking at that. And I was very fascinated by the way that the connections kind of spread out so quickly. When you look at these machine shop records, right, you have these huge amount of letters that come into the machine shops from all around the world, and as you very quickly are like, wow, like they are getting raw materials from England, right? They are corresponding with people in England to sort of get the machine shops itself are taking knowledge from there, and then they're spreading that knowledge out. And then they're getting letters back from Mexico, for example, talking about like this physical machinery. So you get this idea that there's these networks, right? And there's a lot of scholars that sort of talked about industrial networks like in this time period as being important. But these networks are very wide and they just go everywhere, right? When we're talking about Concord, North Carolina, right? A lot of the people involved in these networks, right, are also involved in agriculture to a huge extent. So like all these different parts of the economy are sort of intersecting in this way. And so it becomes like this big spread. And when we think, and it's also right over just not just like parts of the economy, but also over distances, right? And so there are ways that you see very close connections between different countries, right? Especially Mexico and the United States, and also see like these very wide things at the same time. So I kind of like the fact that you can move between time scales in this history very quickly, and you get the understanding that people, I think, at the time period, uh, like were thinking very globally, right? They were thinking in that way that I think sometimes we think is like something that people in like the 20th century, like really like we have this idea that like our perspective today is very global, but I think they also had that vision. And so for me, the transnational thing is trying to recreate partly like how people saw things.
Mhm. Now, machine shops have come up a couple times already in our conversation. For those who don't know, could you perhaps explain what a machine shop is and why it matters?
Yeah, so machine shops sort of began out of like when the initial textile factories were forming in the US, there's this a need to repair machinery, right? So every factory needed its own basic repair shop. And so if something like, especially because a lot of the initial techniques were being imported from England, right? There was like a lack of understanding or a lack of a lot of knowledge. So they needed people on site to like make these repairs. And so after that, people started realizing that you could sell like there's such a demand for textile factories at this period, right? In the very early of 19th century. And so people realized you could sell this. So they started fabricating their own different things like looms, right? Like spindles, right? All the different portions in the process of making textile equipment became part of uh, the object of machine shop, and then they branch out into railroads and steam engines, right? And they could be very big. We're talking hundreds of workers, right? All working on different machines, very complicated things. If you see pictures of them, a lot of what I talk about in my dissertation is about like shipping too, like trying to send these things. They're huge things. So
Yeah.
it's very complicated, very big process. Took a lot of time to sort of learn how to do this. And so that's sort of what machine shops were doing. And then when I was at Hagley, I got to take a look at the Barton Jenks papers, which was a machine. Barton Jenks was a member of the Jenks family who ran the Alfred Jenks and Sons machine shop in Bridgeburg, which is like Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, which is right outside Philadelphia. And so I got to like some of the records at Hagley, right, include like some of the original like designs of the sort of plans and stuff like that. And so that was really interesting to sort of see those original patents. And those two, right, are globally connected because many of them had originally started in England, right? They come over to the US and they basically make them. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, could you perhaps unpack race a little bit and how you're approaching it in your project?
Yeah, and so I'm still, working out the exact kinks about, how this is going because I'm still in the process of writing my dissertation.
Sure,
Clear,
sure.
but one of the things I'm focusing a lot is this idea of skill, right? The idea of skill was so important to how the textile industry was structured, right? Factory workers, right, how they're paid, right, what kind of work they're doing, their working conditions are often controlled by this idea if they are skilled or unskilled workers. And so within the factory, this notion of skill becomes very important. And it's something that, right, machine shops are interested too, in terms of how they promote how factories should be operated, right, in terms of technology, right, based this on idea of skill. And so what I've done when I'm reading through is understanding the linkages between this idea of skill and race, right? The idea of skill itself was very much defined by race, right? Comparisons to enslaved people were common among factory workers to say, look, I'm a skilled worker. That's an example of somebody who's not skilled. So it's this idea of taking these concepts, right, that are sometimes naturalized as sort of economic or just about technology, right? And thinking about sort of how ideas of race were important to them. And then the second way is I also take a peek outside the factory. I'm not just interested in the working inside the factory. I'm interested in the workers who are outside the factory too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Many workers, right? Most factories in the early US, right, were basically restricted to only white workers or white and immigrant workers, especially in places like New England, in North Carolina, right, that becomes a little bit more complicated with having some enslaved workers in the factory. But there is a division between this idea of sort of white workers within factories and then the surrounding areas, right, often relying on, for example, in Lowell, there was a large Black population that was doing jobs like working domestic service. There were Black barbers, lots of different jobs that providing services to workers and to keep the factory sustained. And so there's a racial hierarchy that operates both within the factory, right, and how people talk about work, and then outside the factory and who is supporting it, right? These ideas that there are sort of secondary or tertiary labor markets attached to a factory, right? How do they supply the factory? Well, then it becomes more complicated. And I talk a lot about how workers outside the factory viewed workers inside the factory, right, and thought about these ideas of race, and workers inside the factory looked at outside the factory, right? And so trying to understand how that was working and thinking also about things like the geography of it, right? How factories were built, constructed, right, at Hagley, I was looking at some of the fire insurance records, right? There's this great maps that you can look at through the fire insurance records of
Mm-hmm.
like, and these are very early before even like the Sanborn kind of stuff, right? This is even earlier, just like insurance of textile factories. And you can actually see like where people are living, like in relation to the factory, who is sort of centered, right, and how that helps contribute to the development of ideas of whiteness, the ideas of blackness, and then we look at Mexico, especially ideas of indigeneity, right, are all sort of evolving in this idea. So what I'm interested in doing is sort of placing the idea of the textile factory within sort of these broader conversations of how race is developing in this period, because I don't think typically when we think, right, there's all this great scholarship about how class and gender have sort of structured factories, right? And I'm thinking about how can I engage with that scholarship, right, in sort of tweak it to also talk about race in some ways.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a necessary intervention in the literature. Well, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the materials that you explored in the Hagley archives. Was there perhaps a certain document or set of documents that really set the fireworks off, or perhaps were provided you with a smoking gun of some kind, or really got you excited?
Yeah, so there was one when I was looking at the machine shop records at the Jenks papers, there was a paper or a sort of a pamphlet in there called Cotton Manufacturing in the South,
Hmm.
which was interesting. I was like, why is this pamphlet in here? I knew they were selling machinery, but this was basically what I estimate from what this pamphlet was. It was sort of describing different machinery and advertising for Southern cotton manufacturers to, this is the types of things you need, right? This is how you install them, right? And it was like, it was actually very helpful for me too, because it gave like a whole overview of like the very basics of like, this is how a factory works. Like from a standpoint is like, if you read this, you get an understanding sort of it. And then they talk about, for this is the equipment that we are going to sell. And so it was interesting to see this idea of not just maybe factories are not just ordering equipment themselves, but right, there's actually an advertising and marketing element to how these connections work. But was all, and so that was interesting to it. It was also framed from a very nationalist lens. So when we think about some of these transnational connections, right, and sort of the politics behind that, right, it's playing up this idea that American made machinery is better than English machinery, right? So if you were a factory in the South, right, you should buy American made machinery because our machinery is much better, but also you are sort of helping the nation, right? We can think about these early forms of nationalism that are occurring. So that was also really fascinating. And then in this, they were also sort of, I'm also interested in some of the bottom up approaches of thinking about technology, right? This idea of like technology not just being something that is sort of cast down from elite to workers, but also how workers interact with technology. And
Hmm.
so in the pamphlet, they were talking about sort of how spinners, right, they use, and everyday workers were sort of reacting to the new uses of technology. And so I thought that was interesting too, as a way for thinking about that, and how they had sort of, it wasn't just that they create this technology and expect workers to work around it, but that they thought about, they were adapting the technology to feedback they hear. And you do see this sometimes in letters from machine shops, right? Which is a machine shop will send equipment and then a factory will send a letter back saying, hey, our workers really thought that you should actually increase or decrease the height of something, or you should change how this functions or something like that, because they're very interested. The way they get feedback isn't just from sort of the person ordering it, but also like how it's working on the shop floor. So there's this idea of like shop floor technology being sort of more of a negotiation, maybe
Hmm.
between a machine shop, the factory management, and the workers themselves, rather than just this like idea of just sending out technology into the wind and just saying it either works or it doesn't. So I thought that was really interesting because it was even in the advertising materials. So that was one thing I found fascinating. Another thing I'll talk about is some of the mill records. I saw some differences between sort of like early 19th century and later 19th century or mid 19th century records. So I was looking at things like the Antietam wool mills, um, which is in Funkstown, Maryland, I think. And um, there was like a very big mix of labor practices, and this is like in the 1810 area, um, about worker pay, different pay rates, different discipline strategies, different regulations, right? There was a lot of sort of upheaval in how labor was being managed in the mill. Um, but then when you look at factories like the Bancroft records, right, which are factories more in Rockford, Delaware, right? And obviously, yeah, there's a lot of time has passed and these are different locations, but just thinking more on a broad scale, right? There's a much more systematic look at sort of how hours were worked, right? How days were attended. There are very strict regulations, and the record keeping too, right, has transformed a lot in like this very itemized and scientific way that we see developing during this period. So what I'm interested in thinking about, right, is thinking about this change over time between records in say the 1810s and the 1830s, and how much they've transformed. One, on the fact of like record keeping itself has changed, but also thinking that as a transformation of management practices, right? And thinking about how that changes how workers view themselves, right?
Mm.
When, especially because some of the earlier records, right, we can see a lot of evidence of workers pushing back a lot against these regulations, right? And so seeing that kind of response and changes in factory management is something that I'm interested in looking at over time, and something I've seen in other cases, like in Lowell, for example,
Mhm.
right? And that, of course, goes with the shifting demographics of many of the factories too, right? As factories become more reliant on immigrant workers, right? Which goes back to how we think about race within the textile factory, right? The management practices are changed, right? And so sometimes, right, in history, we see that from one direction, right? We argue that like the management practices are what changed, right? Instead of thinking of it as how, right, the demographics of the workers transforming was part of that management trade, right? And how ideas of race sort of and ethnicity and gender, right? They all sort of informed how the idea of management would happen. So that's something I'm interested in, but still sort of working out exactly what it means. But it was just very interesting to look at those two different mills and the two practices, and get to see reflected both in the history, but also in like the physical document part of this, and like the idea of the archive being produced in that way.
Mhm. I think sort of on the macro scale, something that your project seems to challenge in terms of the sort of received knowledge of American history is that we tend to make the assumption that industrial development, particularly the textile industry, was very regionally concentrated, very much a Northeastern phenomenon. And your example of Lowell, of course, anchors that. But your other examples really turn it on its head, explaining that the Mid-Atlantic, the Carolinas, all the way, of course, through to Mexico, was experiencing similar developments around the same time. And so I wonder how you think your project speaks to that.
Yeah, and I think a lot about that, especially with Mexico, which I think is an example, right?
Mhm.
Um, Mexico is sometimes talked about, right, as a country that had some textiles during this period. But there's this idea, right, that like the US really industrialized in the early 19th century, and Great Britain did, and maybe some parts in Europe. But Mexico isn't sort of as talked much in that. But what I've really thought a lot about was sort of how industrialization in Mexico and the US were much more intertwined with each other,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
That the move people have there are stories, right, of workers from Lowell who moved to Mexico, right, and actually help start becoming management within factories, right? Um, and then, right, when I'm talking about technology, right, there is a response of how workers and factories in Mexico, right, adapt technology for their specific ways that filters back to the United States. And there were actually workers in Mexico who were sent as part of sort of like a government industrial development project to the US
Mm.
to go to some of the mills and see how they were run. So the connections are, first of all, very together, but it's also a way of thinking of industrialization, right, much more as a global process, right? And trying to unpack, while at one time realizing, right, the inequalities that existed between places because of industrialization, but also thinking about how, right, that narrative that industrialization was a very specific thing maybe doesn't fully account for how it was happening in the world, right? And also, right, countries like Mexico have a very long history of industrialization, right? Not just one that we can combine to, right, 20th century phenomenon, for example, right? But they really start this process early and are thinking about this process early, and they have their ideas of industrial development, which are partly influenced by what is going on to the U.S., right? Lowell becomes this like sort of model for a lot of places in the world, right? And there are actually politicians from Mexico who go to Lowell and visit there and look around and say, hey, wouldn't this be great if we could develop a factory that looks like this here? So there's those kind of connections, right? And thinking, I think it's just thinking about right, trying to think about these processes as less as maybe just specific place-based things, but part of larger global discourses that are going around, or transnational discourses in this case, that are going around, right, the world. And just how aware people were of that as well, right?
Mhm. Now, what would you say to someone who is considering doing research at the Hagley Museum and Library? What advice might you give to them?
I would definitely say that there's a couple things I would say. First, I would say that there's such a wide variety of materials to look at. So, especially if you're interested in looking at things like I was like more economic records and stuff, like you're going to find a lot of really great material. And so go through the catalog and look at what you are, but you have to understand like the extent of the collections. And so for me, it was very helpful to sort of get a taste of a bunch of different things and understand when I was there that there was going to be a lot of information before I like dived into it. And so I thought that was really good. I also thought like the environment of Hagley was just very positive for actually doing research. And so I thought it was very productive to get a lot of stuff done. And I appreciated being able to stay on the campus and go and just dive right into things. So I thought that was good as well. But yeah, and I think also when I was there, I talked to a lot of the other researchers who are at Hagley about sort of the collection and the archivists. And so like there's a lot of different things that are at Hagley that if you talk to the archivists and things that were helpful to know about some of the collections and the depth of them. Again, just because of how expansive some of the stuff is, right? It's hard to just get to seeing that from like a finding aid. Like you really have to go there, look at it, and talk about like, okay, what is that actually in here? So yeah, that was something.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for saying so. And Hunter, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been great to learn about your project.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate getting the chance to talk about it.
Oh, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and our many research funding opportunities, visit us online. You can go to hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.